Hello everyone. Welcome back to my channel, April 29th, 1868. Fort Laramie, Red Cloud, Oglala, Lakota. Allied Lakota bands, Northern Cheyenne, Northern Arapaho and representatives of the United States met under a fragile ceasefire. The treaty that followed set aside a great Sioux reservation and acknowledged Sioux rights to the Black Hills. The central question is simple and stark. How did a clear military success by Red Cloud and his allies become the prelude to renewed contest over the Black Hills? The contested ground was not abstract. Powder River Country and the Bozeman Trail shaped seasonal movement and subsistence. Bison and mobility governed food, social relations, and ceremony. Forts and wagon trains that cut through hunting range signaled not only military intrusion, but the prospect of permanent settlement. Federal expansion after the Civil War intensified pressure. Railroad surveys and emigrant traffic created economic incentives to secure transportation corridors. Military posts appeared in 1866 to protect routes. Those posts altered landscape access and introduced new patterns of confrontation between soldiers, contractors, and mobile bands. Military encounters made cost visible. Isolated garrisons proved vulnerable to coordinated strikes that exploited terrain and surprise. The destruction of detached units showed commanders that holding scattered forts would be expensive in men and supplies. For a time, the military calculus favored negotiation over indefinite reinforcement. Red Cloud's objective remained the defense of homeland and hunting grounds. His strategy combined alliance-building, seasonal mobility, and selective engagement to raise the political and fiscal price of occupation. His demand was concrete: remove the forts and restore access to Powder River Country. Washington faced constraints of its own. Post-war budgets, logistics, and competing priorities limited the Army's appetite for a long, costly campaign. Civilian agencies and congressional pressures shaped policy in ways that did not always match field realities. By spring 1868, a treaty offered a legal framework that temporarily closed the Bozeman Trail and recognized territory. Yet, the settlement also set a new legal category that made future claims legible to miners, surveyors, and legislators, a dynamic that would soon reawaken contestation. This episode matters because it links battlefield victory, treaty law, and economic interest. The next chapters trace how those forces met and why a military triumph did not guarantee lasting control of sacred land. The causes of the conflict unfold across immediate triggers and deeper structural pressures that converged on the Powder River Country. After the Civil War, the federal government redirected attention and resources westward. Railroad survey parties moved ahead of full settlement. Survey crews and road builders traced possible routes for the transcontinental lines and for branch roads that would shorten the path to Montana goldfields. Those surveys carried supply trains and civilian contractors, and they signaled the prospect of permanent settlement rather than seasonal passage. The Bozeman Trail became a corridor not only of emigrant traffic, but of commercial and military interest. Where wagons crossed prime bison range, they also crossed the seasonal lifeways of plains nations. Bison decline was fundamental. Market hunters expanding markets for hides and armed commercial parties reduced herds across the plains in the 1860s. The loss of bison altered food security, mobility, and social rhythms. For the Oglala Lakota and allied bands such as the Northern Cheyenne and Northern Arapaho, the buffalo was a material base for ceremony, kinship, and trade. When hunting range narrowed and herds thinned, pressure to defend core grounds intensified. The Army's presence on the Bozeman Trail threatened not merely passage, but the economic and spiritual foundations of plains life. Military choices amplified political risk. In 1866, the War Department established a string of posts to protect civilian traffic. Fort Phil Kearny, Fort Reno, and other posts were intended as defensive anchors for the trail. Those forts required garrison supply trains and escort detachments. Supply lines stretched across difficult terrain and long winters. Commanders found that small, isolated garrisons were costly to hold and vulnerable to coordinated strikes. The Army's tactical assumption favoring fixed posts collided with a plain strategy based on mobility concealment and intimate terrain knowledge. The mismatch raised the fiscal and human cost of occupation. Administrative fragmentation compounded the problem. Civilian Indian agents, the War Department, and political overseers in Washington pursued different priorities. Agents sought to secure annuities and agency control, while military commanders sought secure lines of communication. Congress debated budgets and constituencies for Western expansion lobbied in Washington. The Interior Department's inclination toward legal consolidation and treaty-making often ran ahead of the resources necessary for enforcement. That gap created a cycle. Treaties promised protections that could not be guaranteed without sustained military presence or political will. Immediate proximate triggers filled the vacuum between policy and practice. Road building parties cut through campsites. Scouts reported encroachments and isolated clashes occurred along the trail. Outrages on both sides fed rumors and anxiety. When detachments were ambushed and supply trains harried the public in the east, read dispatches that framed Western operations as perilous and in need of firm control. Those reports produced political pressure to secure corridors for settlers and miners, even as field commanders argued the cost of doing so. For the Lakota Coalition, the objective was clear: defend access to hunting grounds and preserve mobility. Leaders coordinated band movements to threaten isolated posts and to raise the political and fiscal cost of occupation. Their constraints were logistical and seasonal. Winter campaigns were costly for non-combatants. Sustaining long sieges against fortified posts exceeded capacity. For the Army, the objective was to secure emigrant traffic and protect contractors. Commanders faced constraints of supply manpower and congressional appetite for prolonged Western wars. Finally, the legal landscape shaped possibilities. Earlier treaties and usages produced claims and counterclaims in which maps and signatures mattered. The prospect of negotiating a formal settlement appealed to some federal officials as a way to convert military friction into a legal framework that could be administered. Yet the very act of mapping and treaty definition made land legible to surveyors, miners, and speculators. That double effect, temporarily pacifying armed contest while rendering territory visible to economic interest, set the stage for renewed pressure after any military accommodation. Fort Phil Kearny, winter 1866 through spring. 1868 saw a sequence of incidents that moved the conflict from intermittent harassment to sustained strategic confrontation. The pattern began with isolated clashes that revealed tactical weaknesses in the Army's posture and political costs in Washington. Small scouting parties and wagon trains drew fire. Supply columns were cut off. The ambushes and skirmishes were rarely large in scale, but they were constant, and they magnified the sense that holding scattered posts along the Bozeman Trail required more men and money than the post-war government wished to commit. The Fetterman engagement in December 1866 was the first shock that shaped subsequent choices. A detachment sent to patrol near Lodge Trail Ridge was drawn into a deliberate lure. The column vanished. Later accounts found bodies and burned wagons. The immediate military effect was brutal and visible. For commanders, the loss meant that isolated patrols and small detachments could be destroyed when terrain and local knowledge were stacked against them. For plains bands, the result was confirmation that a sustained harassment strategy could inflict disproportionate cost on garrisoned posts. The episode circulated by courier and telegraph to territorial headquarters and then to Washington, where newspapers transformed local setback into national political pressure. A second cluster of incidents in 1867 and early 1868 reinforced the new logic. The wagon box fight and the hayfield fight near Fort Kearny showed that better arms and determined defense could limit losses, but they did not change the underlying strategic calculus. Weather and season shaped each operation. Winter storms complicated resupply. Hot, dusty summers slowed marches and raised sickness among draft animals. The rhythm of campaign season favored plains riders who timed strikes to exploit gaps in escort strength and to withdraw before punitive columns could concentrate. These seasonal patterns meant that the Army's best hope was to either run a costly year-round presence or to create political cover for withdrawal. Communication frictions magnified the effects of each incident. Telegraph lines reached territorial centers, but not frontier camps. Dispatches had to ride on horseback across long distances. Interpreters carried messages between commissioners and band councils. Delays in transmission produced misreadings of intent and amplified rumor. A skirmish reported late could arrive in print as a reputational crisis and spur calls in Congress for immediate action. Similarly, an agent's note that rations were low or that a particular band had suffered winter losses could be interpreted in Washington as evidence that firm military action was required to secure order. The incidents also revealed practical flashpoints that crystallized local grievance into strategic leverage. Road builders and survey parties cut through favored hunting grounds. A surveyor's camp near a prime wintering valley might be expelled 1 month and replaced the next as contractors claimed rights to the road. Each intrusion produced immediate effects. Horses stolen, caches burned, families moved. Those consequences were not abstract. They were the livelihood of those who depended on predictable seasonal cycles. When an Army escort failed to deter a party of prospectors or a contractor, community leaders recorded the loss and adjusted strategy. The pattern of local reaction, smaller raids to seize supplies, larger consolidations to threaten a post, turned sporadic disturbance into a sustained campaign of attrition. Leadership decisions on both sides read these incidents differently. For Red Cloud and allied chiefs, the incidents confirmed that coordinated resistance could impose costs without the need for pitched battle. They sought to raise the political and fiscal expense of occupation by making supply lines perilous and by demonstrating the vulnerability of isolated garrisons. That calculus favored selective action hit, where the enemy was weakest, withdraw before a counterforce arrived and use the terrain to maximize advantage. For Army officers, these incidents argued for either a significant reinforcement of posts or a recalibration of objectives. Reinforcement required appropriations that Congress might refuse. Abandonment opened the trail and the forts to insurgent control, but preserved lives and budget. The social and informational ecology of the frontier shaped public interpretation. Eastern newspapers received field dispatches filtered through territorial editors and military telegraph. Sensationalized headlines seldom conveyed the nuance of seasonal movement or of negotiated truces. A single massacre or a single heroic defense could dominate public memory for weeks. That public memory fed political decisions. Legislators responded to constituent pressure and to lobbying by transport companies seeking protection for transit and by mining interests pressing for access to roads. The incidents therefore had effects beyond the immediate battlefield. They reshaped the political incentives that guided policy. One primary account from the period described the shock of an ambush and its local aftermath in terse official language. Soldier After Action Report, Fort Phil Kearny, 1866. A detachment drawn from its post was overwhelmed on the ridge. Officers and men fell, wagons were destroyed, and the line was for the moment unchecked. This contemporaneous report traveled by courier and telegraph to higher command and became part of the packet of evidence that convinced some officials that a negotiated settlement might be the most practical course. The rising incidents produced immediate logistical stress. Supply convoys rerouted or paused. Contractors increased prices for escorted shipments. Local forts rationed ammunition and food in response to interrupted supply lines. Non-combatants felt the effects in delayed annuities and in market disruptions that limited trade. The calendar of seasons became a calendar of scarcity when a winter blockade or an interrupted migratory circuit reduced meat and hides available for exchange. At the same time, the incidents had a political dimension within indigenous politics. Bands debated the proper balance of resistance and accommodation. Some leaders feared that escalating attacks would provoke punitive expeditions that might bring overwhelming force. Others argued that only persistent pressure would force a strategic concession. Red Cloud's stance grew out of this debate. He judged that a concerted campaign of harassment that threatened the trail and the forts would raise the cost of occupation beyond the federal appetite for reinforcement. The pattern of incidents thus served as a form of bargaining leverage, a means to convert local military pressure into a negotiation table advantage. Finally, the incidents altered the ethical and rhetorical frame available to negotiators. When the Army signaled that the forts were difficult and costly to hold, some civilian officials concluded a treaty might secure long-term peace at lower price. For Lakota leaders, the incidents proved that military pressure could extract commitments. The rising incidents therefore created the conditions for the 1868 settlement. They made clear that indefinite small-scale warfare was unsustainable for the United States, and that a legal compact might produce a pause in conflict. Yet the codification of rights on paper also made lands legible to surveyors and to future interests, setting in motion the very forces that would later revive contestation over the Black Hills. Fort Phil Kearny and the Bozeman Trail Theater converted scattered incidents into a sustained campaign in which movement, logistics, terrain, and administration determined outcomes as much as pitched combat. The Army established fixed posts to control the route. Fort Phil Kearny, Fort Reno, and Fort C.F. Smith became nodes on a narrow line of communication that depended on regular wagon trains, wood-cutting parties, and escort patrols. Those posts required predictable movement along constricted tracks. Predictability created vulnerability. Plains riders watched routes and timed strikes to hit where columns were exposed, or wood parties worked beyond the safety of breastworks. On the United States side, operations were organized around company-sized detachments and ad hoc convoys. Patrols left garrison gates in mixed elements of infantry, cavalry, and teamsters with limited local intelligence. Field decisions often rested on a single officer's judgment. The institutional habit of projecting presence by fixed fortifications collided with the reality of a mobile opponent who used concealment and rapid concentration. Red Cloud, Crazy Horse, and other chiefs did not fight in linear formations. They gathered mounted companies that could appear at a ridge draw, a river crossing, and then disperse into the sweep of the plains. That style of war exploited local knowledge of coulees' ridgelines and timbered draws. It turned pursuit into danger and turned routine escorts into possible catastrophes. Terrain and timing defined contact phases. Patrols sent to secure timber cutters or to escort supply wagons moved over ridges and across narrow valleys where a column's line of retreat could be cut. On December 21, 1866, a patrol under Captain William J. Fetterman left the shelter of Fort Phil Kearny in pursuit of decoys along Lodge Trail Ridge and entered timbered ravines that concealed assembled war parties. The slope and tree line concealed the defenders until the patrol was deep and its avenues of retreat were compromised. Encirclement followed rapidly. The patrol could not form a consolidated defense in the constricted ground and was overwhelmed. Contemporary field returns treated the loss as total for the detachment, with 81 men killed. That outcome circulated quickly in military packets and in public dispatches as a symbol of the dangers of isolated posts. Logistics imposed an operational ceiling on both sides. Federal supply lines ran from territorial depots across country that winter storms could render impassable. Summer heat and swollen rivers slowed wagons and exposed pack trains to raids. The forts depended on contracted civilian teams to move provisions and ordnance. When trains were harried, garrisons rationed ammunition and food and reduced patrols. For indigenous communities, logistics meant different vulnerabilities. Mobility preserved access to wintering valleys, caches, and distant herds. Loss of horses or stores could force families into scarcity. Interruptions that delayed a convoy or seized horses had immediate human consequences. The asymmetric effect was that interruptions to federal logistics degraded garrison capability more than a proportional disruption of indigenous mobility. Rules of engagement and standing orders shaped but did not determine outcomes at the tactical edge. Army policy emphasized protection of civilian traffic and security of posts and authorized patrols to pursue hostile parties, and to arrest those implicated in attacks on trains. Local orders warned against leaving prepared ground with insufficient force. After the Fetterman disaster, field reports and ministerial packets reached Washington. Decision-makers debated whether to augment garrisons or to seek a negotiated resolution. The political arithmetic favored negotiation. Reinforcing multiple scattered posts required appropriations and manpower that Congress and the post-war government were reluctant to provide. Abandonment of the contested corridor in favor of a treaty was for many officials the less costly option in lives and treasure. Two documentary traces capture the campaign as both field action and administrative turning point. A field report summarized the immediate effect of the Fetterman engagement in terse military language. P. St. George Cook. Report, Washington, D.C., 1866. Brevet Lieutenant Colonel Fetterman, Captain Brown, and Lieutenant Grummond. Are the officers killed? Not a man was left alive. That transmission to the Capitol made the tactical loss a strategic artifact. At the policy level, an executive directive that followed the larger campaign signaled formal conversion of military setback into political concession. Ulysses S. Grant, Order, Washington, D.C., in 1868. That order, implementing abandonment of the Powder River forts, reframed the campaign as a managed withdrawal and set the conditions for a treaty settlement that would recognize Sioux use of the corridor. Maneuver and casualty accounting require careful phrasing because contemporary returns and later histories offer varying figures. Army returns recorded American losses at Fetterman as essentially total for the patrol, while indigenous accounts do not preserve a consistent numerical count of enemy casualties. Counting in mounted warfare was imprecise. The political meaning of conspicuous American losses, however, proved decisive. Visible defeats altered congressional calculation and reduced appetite for indefinite reinforcement. The administration faced a choice between sustained costly presence and a negotiated arrangement that might stabilize the frontier at lower cost. Non-combatant outcomes were immediate and severe. Agency records, missionary notes, and ledger entries document families fleeing wintering grounds when survey parties or military columns passed through valleys where caches of meat and winter stores lay. Food shortages followed when bison herds shifted away from contested ground or when hunting ranges became militarized. Cases of captured horses, seized goods, and disrupted trade appear across compensation rolls. Annuitants faced delays as insecurity complicated distributions. Those material hardships intensified intra-community debates about the costs of continued resistance versus accommodation. Leaders had to weigh the welfare of warriors and the survival of non-combatant dependents in seasonal cycles marked by winter scarcity and spring calving. The campaign also had an information and public opinion dimension that amplified tactical events. Telegraph lines connected territorial centers, but not frontier camps. Dispatches rode by courier and then appeared in Eastern newspapers filtered through territorial editors. Sensational accounts of massacres or heroic defenses tended to dominate headlines. A single ambush or a single successful defense could hold public attention for weeks. Those headlines shaped political pressure. Legislators responded to constituent concern and to lobbying by stagecoach and railroad companies, seeking protection for transit, and by business interests pressing for access to Western routes. Incidents on the ground thus fed legislative moods that in turn altered military options. Leadership choices on both sides reflected this contested information ecology. For Red Cloud and allied chiefs, the campaign confirmed that coordinated harassment could convert local tactical actions into national political pressure. They pursued selective operations that threatened supply lines and that demonstrated the vulnerability of isolated garrisons. The goal was not necessarily to annihilate an entire army, but to make occupation expensive and politically fraught. For Army officers and civilian overseers, the same incidents argued either for costly reinforcement or for diplomatic settlement. Reinforcement required funds and political backing that were uncertain. The alternative was to bring the adversary to the table and to frame a legal solution that removed contested posts. Finally, a brief fact versus folklore clarification is necessary. Sensational reports of mutilation and exaggerated casualty descriptions circulated widely in the press and contributed to moral outrage in Eastern readerships. While violence and practices such as scalping did occur in the context of frontier warfare, the scale and tone of many press accounts were frequently amplified by second-hand reporting. Historians caution against treating sensational detail as representative without corroboration from field returns or tribal testimony. Recognizing this distinction helps explain the rhetorical dynamics that pushed political actors toward treaty rather than protracted punitive occupation. The campaign phase thus binds terrain tactics, logistics, and politics into a single sequence. Tactical defeats exposed the limits of a fixed fort strategy. Logistic fragility and political calculation made continued occupation of the Bozeman Trail costly. The administrative choice to abandon the corridor and to seek a treaty converted battlefield pressure into legal recognition temporarily, while also making the land legible to surveyors, prospectors, and speculators whose later return would reopen contest over the Black Hills. The turning point in the larger sequence fell not on a single battlefield, but at the intersection of field discovery, political calculation, and legal maneuvering. The 1874 Black Hills expedition transformed a mapped treaty space into a site of immediate economic demand. Reports that prospectors had found gold in creek beds and gulches shifted the terms of the debate. Prospectors moved in ahead of formal transfer mechanisms. Miners established camps. Local newspapers amplified rumors into waves of migration. The material fact of mineral wealth created incentives that private actors and some federal officials were prepared to convert into property claims. The Black Hills ceased to be in practice a remote part of an Indian reservation and became a center of contestation whose resolution required answers in law and force rather than on the battlefield alone. Federal response moved along two parallel tracks. One was administrative and legal Interior Department officials and congressional committees discussed purchase offers and methods to secure cession. Commissions were appointed and negotiators traveled to agency councils to solicit agreement. The other was political and coercive members of Congress influenced by constituents and by miners lobbying considered withholding annuities or changing appropriation patterns to produce pressure. The commissioners' offers small annuities lease proposals and cash sums were framed to induce voluntary cession, but many Lakota leaders regarded the proposals as inadequate in light of the hill's sacred value and long-term importance for subsistence and ceremony. The commission process thus became both a negotiation and a test of whether formal consent could be purchased in the shadow of mass migration. Leaders faced hard choices under rapidly changing facts on the ground. For many Lakota, the hills were more than economic land. They were sacred places central to history and ritual. To sell land that held those meanings for cash or token annual payments was unacceptable to a wide swath of leadership. The Lakota coalition that had secured military advantage in the Powder River campaigns now confronted a different strategic problem. Would political leverage and moral suasion suffice against the combined pressure of Congress, miners, and settlers? The refusal in many councils to accept commission offers reflected both principled resistance and a realistic assessment of value. The refusal forced federal agents and some politicians to ask whether legislative compulsion was the only practicable route to open the hills. Congressional posture hardened as the summer flows of miners turned into entrenched camps. Political leaders in Washington faced constituent pressure to protect Americans who claimed to have invested in prospecting and settlement. The precedent of enforcing treaty boundaries by forceful removal of civilian intruders was politically unattractive and costly. The alternative, pressuring tribes to cede by statute or by withholding funds, was for many legislators more feasible. In 1875 and 1876, debates shifted toward measures that would restructure reservation boundaries or that would authorize force to compel compliance with new directives. The dynamic was clear. Military success on the plains had reduced the immediate need for battlefield operations in the Powder River corridor, but it had not removed the structural pressures that made the Black Hills contestable in law. Military preparations resumed in a modified form. Field commanders and the War Department planned expeditions to compel bands onto reservations and to restore order in the face of renewed incursions. These preparations culminated in campaigns in 1876 that combined punitive objectives with the aim of protecting migration corridors. Confrontations in the summer of 1876, including engagements that drew national attention, were not simply the continuation of the earlier Bozeman Trail Theater. They were part of a broader federal effort to reorganize territorial control in the face of explosive economic migration and political will. The role of force in this phase was to create leverage that could be translated into reservation adherence and ultimately into statutory dispossession when political actors deemed it necessary. The admission against interest in the later legal record crystallizes the nature of the shift. United States v. Sioux Nation Opinion/Washington, D.C. in 1980. The government's post hoc rationalizations cannot erase the fact that it did not acquire the Black Hills by any lawful means that amounted to the voluntary sale required by the treaties. The taking occurred through a combination of pressure, political choice, and statutory reconfiguration. That judgment framed the turning point as one in which legal process and political power, rather than battlefield outcome, determined ultimate possession. A compact counterfactual helps to clarify why the turning point was decisive. Had federal authorities in 1874 chosen to enforce the treaty line by removing miners and protecting reservation boundaries at substantial cost, the immediate political momentum for statutory compulsion might have been blunted. Enforcing the Fort Laramie boundary would have required long-term military commitment and a willingness to confront popular demands in the West, an outcome Washington proved reluctant to accept. Alternatively, had negotiators offered compensation at levels that recognized both its monetary and sacred values, in a manner acceptable to most bands, a negotiated exchange might have been possible. Neither path occurred. Instead, incremental political choices tolerating miners, appointing commissioners with limited leverage, and later passing measures that altered reservation standing converted the discovery into dispossession. The human consequences of the turning point were swift. Migration into the hills disrupted hunting circuits and produced new sources of violent contact. Bands that had remained mobile now confronted concentrated intrusion that altered seasonal patterns of resource use. The shifting legal environment also affected non-combatant welfare annuity payments, became bargaining leverage. Agency provisions were conditioned on acceptance of new terms, and families faced the prospect of forced relocation if resistance continued. Winters following the campaigns showed increased dependency on ration distributions and sharp spikes in hardship where access to traditional resources had been curtailed. At the leadership level, the turning point forced a strategic realignment. Red Cloud and other leaders recognized that military leverage had limits in a polity that could convert economic pressure and legislative power into territorial change. Tactical success in denying the Army permanent garrisons did not translate into an institutional guarantee against treaty breach, nor did it immunize sacred landscape from the pull of miners and politicians. The subsequent decades of legal struggle, petitions, and litigation grew out of this moment. The realization that the instruments of the federal state commissions, statutes, and courts could be marshaled to override battlefield recognition when political will turned. The turning point therefore rests less on a single action than on a reconfiguration of instruments for securing land. Battlefield tactics remained relevant, but the decisive instruments became politics and law. Once mineral wealth and mass migration altered incentives, federal institutions chose routes of compulsion and statutory adjustment that reshaped the map and reshaped the practical meaning of the 1868 settlement. The result was a durable disjunction, a military victory that won temporary practical control but could not alone guarantee permanent legal recognition against sustained political and economic pressure. After 1876, the contest over the Black Hills and surrounding territory moved out of battlefields and into offices, courts, and agency rooms. The instruments that remade control were not only rifles and columns, but statutes, commissions, and administrative routines. The Fort Laramie language that once recognized Sioux country remained in printed form but successive legal and policy moves gradually converted that promise into a practical regime that advantaged settlers, miners, and leaseholders. Over the following decades, federal law and agency practice altered who could use the land and on what terms. The everyday mechanics of that remaking worked through the Bureau of Indian Affairs and Interior Department procedures. Agents managed annuities, rations, labor contracts, and inventories, while commissioners and interior delegations negotiated cession proposals and boundary modifications. Annual reports and agency correspondence recorded recurring patterns, delayed payments, contested inventories, and negotiations that increasingly contemplated leasing land for grazing or permitting mineral claims. Those routine records built a slow hydraulic machinery that redirected resources and normalized dependence on agency supply and market labor. Legal innovations accelerated change. The General Allotment Act of 1887 reorganized land tenure by assigning parcels to individual households and declaring leftover acreage open to non-native settlement. What appeared as a technical measure had wide social consequence. Allotment fragmented communal landholding, undermined collective governance, and created plots that could be sold or leased into private hands. Over time, a patchwork of trust parcels, private titles, and marketable land reduced the contiguous land base that had supported mobile lifeways and communal ceremony. The allotment framework made dispossession systemic and durable. Education policy worked in parallel to land policy. Boarding schools and agency classrooms removed children from family life and placed them in institutions that prioritized English instruction, industrial training, and Christian discipline. Curricula and administrative rules discouraged native languages, ceremonial hair and dress, and sought to replace kinship obligations with wage labor patterns. These programs interrupted intergenerational transmission of knowledge and ritual and reshaped daily life. Combined with the loss of hunting ranges and dietary changes produced by bison decline, the schooling regime deepened cultural dislocation and long-term social strain. The resource regime on the ground changed the landscape itself. Once prospectors and companies established claims, the hills and adjacent lands moved rapidly into production for timber grazing and mining. Rail and road improvements tied hill camps to eastern markets and made extraction commercially viable at scale. Leases and mineral permits multiplied. Towns and transport nodes appeared. Sacred places became economic nodes. Agency records and contemporary press show how leases, grazing permits, and permits for timber and mining remade formerly sacred terrain into contested economic space where market logics increasingly governed everyday decisions. Demography and public health reflected these transformations. Census returns and agency rolls for the late 19th and early 20th centuries record population declines linked to disease displacement and nutritional stress. Epidemics of smallpox, influenza, and tuberculosis struck communities crowded by forced settlement and dependent on rations. The reduction of bison herds and constrained mobility magnified vulnerability by narrowing dietary options and concentrating people near agency distributions. Mortality spikes and lower birth rates altered household composition and labor structures in ways that persisted across generations. At the same time, indigenous peoples sustained cultural continuance through practices that recorded history and carried memory forward. Winter counts remained an active chronicle. Each pictograph anchored communal memory to seasonal events and preserved local sequences that law and ledger could not erase. Ledger art and pictographic narratives translated experience into portable forms suited to new economic realities. Ceremonial life adaptively continued where possible. Elders and knowledge holders kept song stories and place names alive, even as formal institutions sought to suppress them. Those expressive forms functioned as parallel archives that articulated sacred claims in mediums readable by kin and later by historians and courts. Memory also found institutional avenues. Leaders engaged Washington through petitions, public addresses, and litigation, while communities organized local commemorations and stewardship practices to protect sites. Legal contests and litigated claims joined with oral testimony, winter counts, and tribal petitions to form a composite archive of grievance and proof. The century-long sequence of petitions, suits, and public testimony culminated in modern litigation that acknowledged the legal wrong of taking, yet also made clear the limits of monetary redress as a substitute for return. The public record and court files now sit alongside winter counts and ledger books as dual repositories of claim and history. Contemporary life in and around the Black Hills shows both the durability of dispossession and the persistence of cultural renewal. Oglala Lakota and other Lakota bands maintain reservation communities such as Pine Ridge and Rosebud, and continue ceremonies, language programs, and legal advocacy. Tribal governments operate cultural centers, repatriation initiatives, and legal offices that press land claims and manage cultural resources. Language immersion programs, cultural revitalization projects, and collaborative museum work demonstrate active efforts to restore practices interrupted by the 19th century policy regime. Viewed together, these administrative, legal, demographic, and cultural strands explain how battlefield success became one chapter inside a longer process that remade sovereignty. Law and administration did not merely follow war. They restructured space personhood and everyday obligation in ways that outlasted tactical victories. Yet, the record of resistance memory and ongoing legal and cultural work shows that the story is not closed. Communities continue to assert ritual use, to steward sacred sites, and to teach new generations the histories recorded in winter counts, ledger art, and oral testimony. The Federal Archive and tribal repositories therefore document both dispossession and persistent work of refusal, remembrance, and renewal. Scholars assess the sequence around Red Cloud's war in the Black Hills in three interlocking conclusions. First, historians agree that the 1866-1868 campaign forced a tangible tactical and political concession. The United States abandoned its Bozeman Trail forts and negotiated the Fort Laramie Agreement. That outcome demonstrates that indigenous military strategy on the plains could produce meaningful, if temporary, leverage over federal operations. Second, scholars note that the legal recognition established in 1868 was fragile because it entered a political economy already inclined toward expansion. Maps and treaties made land legible in new ways and thus exposed it to the pressures of miners' rail interests and congressional politics. Third, there is broad consensus that the later dispossession of the Black Hills must be understood as the product of converging forces, economic discovery, political calculation, and administrative machinery rather than as a simple reversal achieved by one decisive campaign. Important areas of debate remain, and they shape interpretation. Quantitative questions persist about casualty counts, demographic loss, and the economic calculus facing both parties. Archival returns vary, and oral accounts sometimes record different emphases. Historians dispute the extent to which individual leaders such as Red Cloud anticipated the legal mechanisms that would later be used to displace the Lakota from the hills. Some argue that negotiators in Washington deliberately exploited ambiguities. Others emphasize structural drivers such as market demand and settler pressure that made displacement likely regardless of particular decisions. There is also scholarly discussion about sources and voice archival documents in federal repositories privilege written records, while winter counts, ledger art, and oral testimony preserve indigenous chronologies that complicate linear narratives. The enduring legacy of the episode appears in law policy memory and cultural practice. Legally, the sequence produced one of the clearest modern acknowledgments that treaty protections had been violated. The later judicial finding and offer of compensation recognized wrongs, while also exposing the limits of monetary redress. Policy-wise, the episode illustrates a pattern in United States Indian policy where treaties could be subordinated to political expedience and economic interest. In memory, the events have become anchors for contemporary claims and cultural regeneration. Winter counts, ledger art, oral testimony, and tribal petitions kept the story alive through generations. Contemporary tribal governments, cultural centers, and legal offices carry the work of stewardship and advocacy forward. Public commemoration and scholarship now place the sequence in a broader history of indigenous resistance and federal expansion. The case endures in public and legal memory because it shows in a single arc how battlefield victory and treaty recognition can be overtaken by economic appetite and political choice, leaving a lasting lesson about the limits of military success when confronted by state power and market demand. Thank you for watching. This story shows how decisions, resistance, and memory entwine, and the Black Hills question remains unresolved. Which source matters more to you when judging the past written archives or community memory? Tell us why in the comments and subscribe for more episodes.